Laura Palmer, Henry Spencer, Dorothy Valens, Paul Atreides, Lula Fortune, Fred Madison, Joseph Merrick, Alice Wakefield, Dale Cooper, Jeffrey Beaumont, Alvin Strait, Sailor Ripley, Betty Elms, Dick Laurent, Bob. David Lynch is, in my opinion, the greatest American director that has ever lived and potentially will ever live. I saw someone describe that if you were to make a montage of your 5 favorite minutes of film from any of his works, whether focusing on entire scenes or select images that become seared in your mind, you would not only have 5 minutes of the most iconic moments in all of film, but there would also be so many moments from his work missing that it would drive most mad. Few directors have ever had their name transformed into a singular adjective projected onto the works of so many that while there can be a debate as to what Lynchian exactly entails, if you create a film that, regardless of genre, whether comedy, horror, or drama, that escapes into the world of the surreal, blending the worlds of real and fantasy, having an audience peering into a place that feels so connected to our own yet so distant, but dances inside of a space with an absence of logic that sits between a dream and a nightmare, then you've made your own Lynchian film in the eyes of the public. This man captured the imaginations of so many with a singular image that I can imagine everyone has from their favorite David Lynch film, whether they find themselves embracing the fear trapped inside of Eraserhead, or looking behind the closed doors of the seediest part of your neighborhood in Blue Velvet, or finding yourself enchanted by an actress trying to become a star in Mulholland Drive. But when thinking about David Lynch's films, it's not just the surrealist stories that have made him stand the test of time. It's the way that he's able to write some of the most humanist characters to ever grace the silver screen. Whether these are characters that are entirely fictional from the mind of David Lynch himself, adapted from other works in the case of Dune, or even those who've lived real lives who've had portrayals of their life immortalized forever in the filmography of David Lynch, they've all left an impression on us. It is well documented that many who've experienced abuse, specifically abuse inside their homes, found themselves inside Sheryl Lee's portrayal of Laura Palmer, who I think personally gave my favorite performance of all time in watching Twin Peaks Fire Walk with me. In thinking about the majority of David Lynch's work, however, I find that humanism is often overlooked, with few characters ever getting this focus, the few of which include Laura Palmer and especially Joseph Merrick in The Elephant Man, where there may be a focus on the entirety of the straight story, but this humanism radiates throughout all of his films and characters. To be Lynchian, you are not only existing in the surreal, but you must also be deeply human. On January 14th, I had the opportunity to watch Lynch Oz and develop a deeper understanding of David Lynch's love of The Wizard of Oz through this documentary. I feel like most people see this inspiration of The Wizard of Oz when looking at The Wild of Heart, but also after watching this documentary, I was inspired to watch The Wizard of Oz for the first time in nearly 20 years after disliking it as a child, and caused me to begin drafting a video about my love for the man himself. 2 days later, on January 16th, 2025, David Lynch tragically passed away. And I want to say for well over a month, I found myself crying every single day thinking about his passing. I spent some time on here and other platforms on the internet to talk about the dangers of parasocial relationships, yet with David Lynch, everything has felt so different. It's even felt that way when talking to friends, mutuals of mine, and just other people online. And I think there's something about what it means to be seen across such an evocative world, and to be seen and understood and felt and heard and just embraced, and David Lynch did all of that. Entering into Twin Peaks, I felt the immediate and palpable loss of Laura Palmer without ever knowing who she was. Watching his films, I can understand the feeling of wandering through the fields of your hometown and quickly discovering something greater and darker than your immediate comprehension. I could be seen having my world collapsing around me as I begin to question everything about myself, no one seeming to recognize me quite the same, and I might realize I'm a different person than I thought I was. Becoming trapped in my own fears, wanting to escape from the world that has been crafted around me because of my own overwhelming anxiety. I find myself in all of David Lynch's characters, and I find that to be equally horrifying and also wonderful at the same time. David Lynch was an artist who cared so deeply about the form and the artwork itself, and that's so apparent whenever you watch any interview with him, see any bit of behind the scenes footage, and listening to every single collaborator talking about how they brought out the best of themselves because of David Lynch. There's this continuous praise for a man that helped them transform as artists, and I feel this as well as just someone who viewed his art. And like many, for the past couple of months, I've been finding myself revisiting some of my favorites of David Lynch, as well as wanting to reappraise some of the other films, and coming back to these films, I actually found myself so overwhelmingly sad. At first, I assumed this was because of my love of the man that meant so much to me and my love of film, but this was also because I found myself connecting to these characters in a way that I hadn't before. Removed from the shock and pushing through the surrealism and dream logic, I found myself feeling, and to journey beyond the nightmare, we must embrace these emotions as we venture into all that is Lynchian. Because David Lynch is David Lynch not because of the horror or because of the shock, but because of his many beautiful characters. Just as a quick sidebar, if you're enjoying what you're seeing so far or you've enjoyed other videos from me, please consider liking, subscribing, and also hitting that bell. Or also comment down below with your favorite David Lynch film or some words that you might have for the man himself. You can also find me on these other platforms as well, including Letterboxd, TikTok, Instagram, and Blue Sky. Thank you all for tuning in, and also tuning into a video that's much more somber and soft than typical videos on this page. And before we become like the dreamer who dreams and lives inside the dream, we need to first understand dream logic in order to understand David Lynch. To explain dream logic, I want to share a brief story that I overheard that baffled me in someone's interpretation of David Lynch, and also explain something about the initial release on DVD of Mulholland Drive. Several years ago, I had the pleasure of seeing Mulholland Drive at a 1 p.m. Monday screening at my favorite theater in the world of the Senator Theater, and every time I think about that screening and how amazing the film is, I can't help but think about an encounter I had with an older gentleman who was buying popcorn before the movie, talking about how of all of David Lynch's films, Mulholland Drive was by far his least favorite. Now, for anyone who hasn't seen David Lynch before, this is a bit controversial. Typically, Mulholland Drive is people's favorite. He found himself speaking on how little sense the film made, which again feels insane considering the fact that David Lynch has also made Eraserhead, Lost Highway, and Inland Empire, and to his effort, he named seeing the film well over a dozen times, trying to solve every riddle, trying to understand the fate of Betty Elms, or is it a Diane Selwyn? Regardless, this man mentioned finding himself glued to an insert that came with this DVD entitled David Lynch's 10 Clues to Unlocking This Thriller, which has gained notoriety since the inclusion with the DVD release because of David Lynch famously never wanting to discuss the meaning of any of his films. And this feels important because 1, the thoughts of anyone else should not be gospel, whether this is someone that you respect or someone who stumbled across this video that's never seen me on any other part of the internet before, and 2, in this specific instance, I think it can give you tunnel vision, focusing on a few clues that may seem like red herrings to some, or take your eye away from anything else that resonates with you in terms of your own interpretation of the narrative. And all this is a bit more perplexing considering the fact that I, and I'm sure many others, consider Mulholland Drive easy to understand, especially compared to other David Lynch films, with the belief that the first 2/3 of the film are representative of an idealistic dream of these characters, and the final third feeling like a crashing back to the cold and upsetting reality. With dream logic, not everything needs to make coherent or logical sense, just think about your own dreams or nightmares that you may have. As an 8-year-old, I remember one distinct nightmare where I could see a forest decay out of the corner of my eye, and as I shifted my head 90 degrees to the left, I could see even more of that forest rot away in front of my eyes before Ronald McDonald wearing a pirate costume appeared in front of me, frowning in an almost comical way, before then grabbing my shoulder and making me feel a sharp pain that woke me up. Although none of this could happen in real life, and I could recognize as a child that there's no way this was true, I still felt this overwhelming fear that was impossible to shake and made for such a distinct nightmare, and I still remember it more than 20 years later. Fear overtook me regardless of how little sense it all makes, and that is dream logic. You stare into a world so similar to ours, yet nothing ever feels quite real, and yet it can affect you deeply. And for the most part, this is how I describe David Lynch's films because most of them embrace dream logic. And even for those who find themselves caught up in interpreting the narrative of the film, the love people hold for Mulholland Drive is all about the feeling of emotion coming out of the film, seeing the wonder in Naomi Watts' eyes fade away into cold bitterness and jealousy, making for a frightening experience. Going back to the very beginning of David Lynch's filmography, and when thinking about one of the boldest directorial debuts I've ever seen, I found myself sobbing when watching Eraserhead this time. What was once a horror film to me was now a tragedy. Shed away the aesthetic that you might associate with a midnight movie, the lo-fi horror crafted from a shoestring budget through years of filming, the echoes of the industrial noise likely inspired by David Lynch's time in Philadelphia, and a bizarre alien-like child covered in an unknown slime, appearing incomparable to anything I'd come across before as we hear it wail into the night, but I just found myself crying at this story about the anxieties of fatherhood, being unsure how to provide for this new being that you help bring into this world, not wanting to provide any harm, but also not knowing how to make any of this more manageable or easy. This rewatch was so deeply sad, which still, upon reflection of that watch nearly 2 months ago, shocks me. It's more than fair to describe many aspects of David Lynch's films as autobiographical. It never feels accidental that Eraserhead was made after the birth of David Lynch's daughter, Jennifer, who would later have her own career directing films and is much more known for directing television nowadays, including on Daredevil. And to go back to the film, I think I found myself moved because I found myself trapped in Henry Spencer's fear. Sure, I do think there's some dark humor in the incompetence of this character, and even if the answer's out there, I don't want to know if David Lynch wrote it with any kind of critical look towards himself. But I also found so much compassion for Spencer's actions throughout the film, and the act of infanticide, which while should be condemned, is ultimately the darkest of fantasies of a tired, exacerbated, and overwhelmed parent, and I also understood it. I think to view this human core gave me a whole new appreciation of Eraserhead. It's likely why when Mel Brooks had the opportunity to preview the film when looking for the director of Elephant Man, he found David Lynch to be the perfect choice. When viewing all of David Lynch's films, I think of all of his films in groups, all connected through when they were made and their subject matter. For instance, Eraserhead and The Elephant Man are one group of films to me that are not only foundational in Lynch's ability as a director, not minimizing these two of course, but just drawing attention to how similarly I perceive Eraserhead and The Elephant Man. David Lynch was able to bring a humanist to Joseph Merrick's life named John Merrick in the film that at times draws on the real horror that Merrick felt interacting with the everyday people due to people being so uncomfortable around disability, being othered in nearly every interaction, with so many being voyeurs to his smallest moments, and making sure first and foremost that we understood this was a man with many feelings, that Joseph Merrick is one of many. David Lynch evokes so much emptiness from staring into the quiet hallways that shape most of Joseph Merrick's life, but in it there's also so much room for love. And with love there comes so much room for peace, thinking about the uncertainties of what happens next. Dune will sadly not get covered at all in this video. The film is clearly David Lynch's, and considering Lynch directed this, I understood his approach being much more connected to the fantasy of the magic of the world than Villeneuve's, or at least that is my interpretation of it. But because Dune was not the roaring financial or critical success that Universal had hoped, one, many people believe that Dune was impossible to adapt for a long time until Denis Villeneuve's films proved that to be an inaccurate assessment. Two, it also meant that David Lynch was never going to direct a Dune sequel. And three, in the aftermath, David Lynch would start pursuing a much more personal project. A project he'd been reflecting on for well over a decade earlier, where Lynch ruminated on three things: a feeling, the idea of finding a human ear in a grassy field, and Bobby Vinton's rendition of Blue Velvet. This led to David Lynch making, of course, Blue Velvet, a film with the smallest budget released by the De Laurentiis Entertainment Group, a film that featured David Lynch giving room to experiment after the failure of Dune, a film where he was given complete artistic freedom and final cut. The relatively small film would continue David Lynch's long-time partnership and friendship with Kyle MacLachlan, and although the film took place in Lumberton, North Carolina, it's also a film that connects back to Spokane, Washington, where David Lynch grew up. Like how I mentioned Eraserhead and Elephant Man make up a thematic pairing of David Lynch's work, the films Blue Velvet, Wild at Heart, and Fire Walk With Me do the same. These are films that peer deep into the Americana, showing David Lynch's love for this country, but also his deep disturbance with the evil that lurks within the American suburb. If Blue Velvet is about the evil that takes place behind closed doors in the seediest parts of your hometown, Wild at Heart is about how this evil continues all throughout the heart of each town, and Twin Peaks, and by extension Fire Walk With Me, is about how this evil can exist inside of your own home. As we're on the topic, and I want to make this clear, while I will speak on Fire Walk With Me and a bit about Twin Peaks the television show, for the most part I'm keeping the show off limits just because of how all-encompassing the show is, and how much I really do have to say when talking about my feelings on the show and its themes, because it's my favorite television show of all time, and also because I'm planning a much bigger video that's of large scale that'll be released sometime in summer of 2025. And for any late adopters of this video, if you're lucky, it might be out right now. But to go back to this dichotomy of light and dark that feels so present in David Lynch's works at this time and beyond, Greg Olson, who wrote the book David Lynch Beautiful Dark, mentioned the belief that David Lynch's time growing up in the Pacific Northwest is shown through his idealism and hope for love healing all at the heart of every small town in America. His time in Philadelphia, living in a low-income and high-crime neighborhood, shaped his fears for the worst in the world, and no offense to anyone who lives in Philly. I have a number of friends there, there's nothing wrong with the city. This specific experience just happened to shape David Lynch's thoughts about Philly and the world. Beyond the connection to Spokane, Lynch has also named there's a specific autobiographical nature to the film. He said, "Kyle is dressed like me. My father is a research scientist for the Department of Agriculture in Washington. We were in the woods all the time. I sorta had enough of the woods by the time I left, but still, lumber and lumberjacks, all this kind of thing, that's America to me. Like the picket fences and the roses in the opening shot, it's so burned in, that image, and it makes me so happy. That was in a lot of our childhoods." Lynch shared this in Film Comment magazine in their September-October 1986 issue in an article Out to Lynch. This fear of the unknown, whether that is what happens behind closed doors or what happens in the future that we can't anticipate, feels so present in Blue Velvet, even in Lynch's description of he and his brother seeing a nude woman running down the street at night as a child, which Lynch remembered as traumatic and inspired the near-last scene that we have with Isabella Rossellini's Dorothy Valens. Blue Velvet's pristine facade of a small town is shattered by Jeffrey Beaumont's discovery of this ear. He could have avoided the evils of this place, but he finds himself thrust into a nearly inescapable darkness, which sometimes I could even feel visually when just looking at the film, witnessing MacLachlan's character or Laura Dern's Sandy Williams seemingly shining bright amongst nothingness in the dark, inadvertently setting themselves up as the sacrifice if they cannot triumph over the evil of this town, but they are able to. Discovery also allows Jeffrey to come across his brunette to his blonde in this picture, a common image Lynch calls upon in many of his works, and is allowed to discover sex in this lover only by being in the dark. It's only by following the literal rot in front of him that Jeffrey can find hope, or it's only by going deeper into the dark that he can find the light. This prevailing optimism is inescapable at most of the conclusions of a David Lynch film, with many arguing for the possibility that there's even more dark underneath and we're just lying about the depth of the facade. Lynch's desecration of the American family and town is only possible by helping us realize that the Jeffreys and the Dorothys and the Sandys and even the Franks are all amongst us in every town and every bit of America, and we all know all these people. Seeing this film for nearly the first time in 5.5 years, I found myself so thrown off by the shape and the form of this film when I first saw it. My own shock at gazing upon Lumberton's perverse underbelly overshadowing my connection to each and every one of these people, and David Lynch's ability to show us that we can pull ourselves out of these depths. Now, I do want to talk about Wild at Heart, mostly because there's an argument that this is David Lynch's most underrated film, yet it's also his one film that won the Palme d'Or. Featuring my favorite actor of all time, Nicolas Cage, and once again returning to a David Lynch film, Laura Dern, and as I said before, this is David Lynch's take on The Wizard of Oz, having our leads parade across this dilapidated and faded yellow brick road, only able to find hope through their final transformation at the end of the film, or really just through sailors. In The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy is able to escape her small town in Kansas to Oz, and in Wild at Heart, Sailor has taken a man's life and then he's able to escape the law and attempt to run away from those that pursue him. And it's here that's established so quickly and so early on, and the central love that we see between Sailor and Lula becomes a guide and light in so many ways for people that you may not even want in your everyday lives, but you still find yourself rooting for. By seeking out the light, Lula is able to find some peace from her past trauma and abuse, and for Sailor, he's able to look further into the future and recognize he needs to make changes to find joy and happiness in a family. And sometimes these beings of darkness become personified in haunting specters such as Willem Dafoe's Bobby Peru. There is more to the man than his disgusting, yellow, rotting teeth or that thin, disgusting mustache. Behind all of this is a demon, a personification of so much of the hate in the world that David Lynch saw, literally assaulting Lula and having her confront her awful past in a way that feels so alarming and so dissonant compared to the rest of the picture. In fact, whenever we do talk about Lula being assaulted in the past, it feels so jarring but also so serious, especially compared to a film that revels in the raw, animalistic, sexual nature of Lula and Sailor, and it's clearly framed in a much more positive way, and their love seems to help them defeat the dark, with Bobby Peru literally causing him to explode. To find hope in a world that, while rooted in fantasy and excessive violence, casts a looming shadow that runs parallel to a world that we know, potentially pointing towards David Lynch's own worries about the world. Worries that seem most realized in the horrors that befall Laura Palmer in Twin Peaks. And while I said that I'm avoiding talking about the television show for the most part, including the return for now, please do stay tuned, I do want to think about how much Fire Walk with Me shook me to my core. It establishes further context that the horrors that Laura Palmer faced in her every day, whether those inflicted by her father on his own volition or through Bob, and yes, Bob only amplified those desires of Leland and caused him to act on them aside from killing Laura. We as an audience feel like we know so much about Laura because of the framework we've established from the television show, but we spend little time with her other than visiting her ghost, seeing her doppelganger, looking onto a dark-haired clone of her and her own cousin, and largely through the projections and ideas of others. And that is the alarming realization for me with Fire Walk with Me. We never knew who Laura Palmer was, and to live through her final 7 days makes the original television show much more effective, which is disappointing to know how people received the film upon its release. And separately, while this is an issue for any David Lynch screening, I find myself especially disgusted with the laughter found in the responses to Fire Walk with Me when I saw this in theaters. The cold open in this film following two agents that seem to separate different qualities of Cooper into two people and exist in a town that feels like an inverse Twin Peaks Deer Meadow. No one is warm, no one is friendly, no one seems to care, and it's at this point that we can name that what happened in Twin Peaks happens in many small towns in America, and there is an evil behind every single closed door in your home that is never addressed. And also in the context of this video, it shows that even when you're presented with a haunting situation and the surrealist elements that many people call Lynchian, none of it ever matters if we're never sitting in the humanism of David Lynch. It's that humanism that makes it heartbreaking to understand Laura's trauma. That humanism is shaped by being able to sit in the gut-wrenching scream that we hear at the high school at the anticipation of the announcement of the death of Laura Palmer. We never hear the words that the officer whispers in this scene, but we see the look on Donna's face, and we hear the whimper of Laura's name, and we see that empty chair, and we hear the snap of that pencil, and we can feel the pain. We can feel the loss. There is an absence that fills up that room immediately. And sadly, none of Twin Peaks is nearly as effective without the majority of the audience believing that Leland is a wacky and kooky dad, and maybe he was, because it makes for the discovery of the betrayal and abuse towards Laura all the more devastating interesting and sadly more real, again speaking to why so many women saw themselves in Sheryl Lee's performance in the film. At one point in time, Twin Peaks was one of the most popular shows on television, eating its way into the mainstream and becoming water cooler television, with the necessity to watch each night's episode to unfurl the mystery with your coworkers and try to understand who killed Laura Palmer. But it's not the mystery that kept everyone invested, it's the melodrama. It's all these people in this small town that felt like you and I. And while it's not all David Lynch's doing that tapped into all of this, but his expression of this idea in Fire Walk With Me changed my perception of film. To be granted the knowledge of this light past the darkness you experience, whether that's the angel that Laura encounters or Dale Cooper, Laura's happy ending comes from her passing and knowing that tragedy can end. David Lynch's Los Angeles trilogy could easily be described as Lynch's most perplexing set of films, with Mulholland Drive being by far his most popular, but that same level of analysis still leading to confusion likely that would make someone baffled if they were to come across Lost Highway or Inland Empire, two films that are so steeped in genre and that are so willing to abandon their form that they become much more emotional because of that. I'd argue that there's a real strong connection between David Lynch's work before Lost Highway and also after Lost Highway, but at the same time I feel like it feels like a much more specific examination of what David Lynch is trying to get at. Sure, LA is a bit of the Americana, and I guess we could say these films are an examination of the Americana with also celebrity, but also it feels a lot more autobiographical, especially Lost Highway, especially when you know that David Lynch owns the property that the film was filmed at. I'd argue that it feels like David has taken some of the themes of his much more recent films, the ones that were released before Lost Highway, and zoned in on them a little bit more, magnified them, taken them to a bit of a deeper place. And again, while Mulholland Drive has the strongest sense of narrative that I think your everyday viewer can follow, these are all films about losing yourself in the most literal ways possible. All these films feature actors existing in multiple roles, whether we're looking at Patricia Arquette as Renee Madison or Alice Wakefield, or Robert Loggie as Mr. Eddie or Dick Laurent, or Laura Dern in Inland Empire as Nikki Grace and Sue Blue, and especially Naomi Watts and Laura Herring's dual roles in Mulholland Drive. In the two of these three films that play around the most with genre and about our ability to perceive what's happening in front of us, Lost Highway and Inland Empire are also two of David Lynch's most horrifying. I think it's overall very telling the fact that these films are so terrifying for people, considering the fact that people are able to experience themselves so vividly in all the characters of these films, yet I doubt very few people could give a narrative summary of each film, nor does I think that really matter. Celebrity as an added element of each film brings me back to actually some of my thoughts on Fire Walk With Me, or specifically the idea of what is real and what is not, and what do we project onto the artist, and to extend that, what happens when we lose control of our narrative. Maybe most apparent to me in Inland Empire, which is the film that most people often try to reach out to me and try to attempt to understand my interpretation of the film, because of its three intertwined storylines I truthfully don't think are sensical or really flow in any chronological way, but when we question our reality and then others are questioning our narrative, how can we ever really be perceived for who we are? This is an idea present to me throughout the entire LA trilogy, and again, just as another case showing that regardless of our interpretation of what is in front of us, it's the emotion that we latch onto. Laura Dern's face has been plastered all across the internet as a meme that not many can identify as being several frames inside of Inland Empire, and even with that knowledge, nothing can prepare you for the horror of the film in that scene, which might be one of the most horrific of all time, and without what might be Laura Dern's greatest role of all time in finding ourselves in this character, it never mattered how we interpreted this in the first place. With the news of David Lynch's passing, I felt like many people who loved his films were trying to help others who were discovering his films for the first time, try to find some kind of discernible watch order, trying to help guide everybody to the David Lynch film, giving everyone their own room for interpretation because they understand there's not just one great David Lynch film. And when I think about my own answer for what the best film is, I have to say Fire Walk With Me, and many naming what is David Lynch's most accessible film to start with. Primarily with The Elephant Man, and then The Straight Story would follow, but while I agree with The Straight Story's accessibility, I noticed many downplaying its qualities because of its lack of surrealist elements and straightforward narrative, but to me it's the perfect distillation of everything David Lynch. Only a man who could be searching for the light in all the dark in the world could tell the story about two brothers distant after a toxic argument involving alcohol, with one now nearly a decade later traveling by lawnmower from Iowa to Wisconsin due to his lack of a driver's license, and create this film that is primarily about our capacity to love, how that love can stretch across the entire Americana and have us achieving incredible feats, just to wrap everything up nicely in the importance of an apology in order to create a repair and connect us all once again. Based on the real life of Alvin Straight and his 1994 journey to see his brother, the film had always affected me, whether it was seeing this story of these two brothers reuniting, or knowing the pain that Richard Farnsworth, the actor who played Alvin, experienced making the film because of his own terminal prostate cancer, which would later cause him to take his own life. Because it's also a film about how grand and picturesque the United States is, despite it being such a flawed and evil place at times. It's a film that in its first few moments lingers in an uncomfortable tension having us slowly enter Alvin's home expecting the worst, only to see a man in light spirits after having a fall, but then we get this news about his brother. The journey becomes all the more powerful because we see Alvin's determination, moving at just a snail's pace, hoping to get a few more moments with his brother, and is also so willing to strike up conversation with anyone he comes across, with everyone showing such great empathy towards one another. In one of the first instances where we see Alvin meet a hitchhiker, he speaks to a young pregnant teenager about the importance of family. We understand that Alvin is haunted by his own past, a man whose alcohol issues affected his own relationship with his own brother. There's much felt in the silence in many parts of this film, but nothing is more effective than seeing Alvin and his brother reuniting after many years, with Lyle understanding what Alvin did to be there, and having these two sit so silently, gazing at the stars above them, as two beings resting in the celestial body among billions, in a cosmos far more vast than we can ever comprehend. To have the light of these two be at the center of the darkness of the universe tells you that love can conquer all around us and can help us heal from the worst of circumstances, and that to me is Lynchian. David, the sensitivity that you show to the world around you and also every single character that ever graced your screen is truly remarkable and something that none of us ever took for granted. It's one thing to appreciate a character, it's another thing to find qualities of ourselves trapped inside of these characters. It's another thing for a filmmaker to have us feel so seen throughout the entirety of their work. And I don't think I've ever felt so seen watching somebody's work before. There is an absence that I cannot shake off since you've been gone, and I don't think you can ever be replaced, but I think I found a little bit more peace for that today. Thank you for reminding me that there's so much love in this world, because without that discovery, I don't know if I could be who I needed to be during the hardest moments of my past couple of years. Thank you all again, and I hope to see you all very, very soon.